ahead and start the work session. Angel's apparently trapped on a train that's not moving. She'll join us as soon as she can. So our only item is the Hillside Manor Park Project and update. And it looks like we have a whole raft of people to do that. So whoever is coming up, please come up.
Good afternoon, Mayor Gamba, City Council, Erin Maxey, Housing and Economic Development Coordinator. I'm just up here to quickly introduce the team that's going to give you an update on the Hillside Master Planning process. We have Stephen McMurtry from the Housing Authority of Clackamas County and Lisa McLennan from Scott Edwards Architecture. So if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to come back up and answer them, but I'll let them take it away.
Cool, thank you. And before we get started really quickly, I don't know if the folks in the audience were just here to listen or were hoping to speak on the subject tonight. We have to dash out of this in now 40 minutes to go to the opening of Northwest Housing Alternatives, so we won't be taking any comment on this at this time, but at 6 o'clock when we come back for the regular session, we have that time that you can give public comment then. So if you would like to do that, we will be back at 6. Thanks. All right. Stephen.
Thank you so much for having us here today. Again, I'm Stephen McMurtry, the Director of Housing Development with the Housing Authority of Clackamas County, joined here today by Lisa McLennan, our lead project architect with Scott Edwards Architecture. And we're just giving you an update, informational update on the Hillside Park Master Plan. And we know that time is short. We want to make sure we leave lots of time for questions, so we'll kind of get to it. So the project background, currently we have a 16-acre site with 200 units of affordable housing as it exists today. We are moving the project forward from a financing standpoint through what's called the HUD Rental Assistance Demonstration Project, as well as HUD's Section 18 program, which allows us to take the existing Hillside Park units and reconstruct them, get rid of the existing units and reconstruct them, which allows us the new neighborhood vision that we've been talking about. The Hillside Master Plan will set the vision for a vibrant mixed-use, mixed-income community, and I'll provide a little more detail on what we mean by mixed-use and mixed-income in a moment. That will give us the opportunity to rebuild existing affordable housing at the 16-acre site while creating new opportunities for expanding housing options and typologies. Up to 400 new affordable housing units, which is a point of contention we will talk about a little bit. What we mean by that is that for every unit that is a replacement unit through the HUD process that I talked about, we will build 4 units. So for every replacement unit, 4 units. So we get from the 100 existing units that we are replacing on the site, we will build an additional 400 units there. As well as community gathering space, enhanced outdoor recreation areas, and amenities that we hope will serve the Hillside neighborhood as well as our Hillside residents as we move forward. So a little bit on the housing continuum, which we've been asked to provide some more information on. I know many of you have heard this already, but what we're really talking about for Hillside Park is serving that mixed income community. So in a housing continuum, if you look at the blue highlighted area that says Metro Bond Funds, which would be the primary financing vehicle that we would use for the redevelopment of this site, we're really talking about serving individuals that are currently served by the Housing Authority, those that are typically 0 to 30% of area median income, all the way up into what we'd call the first-time homebuyer category. Those would be projects that are sponsored by the Housing Authority of Clackamas County or with project partners. We also know that in a mixed income scenario where we want to promote lots of different income types, that we also have significant interest from the marketplace in providing market rate housing, so that housing that serves even above the 80th percentile. We're not entirely sure how many of those units may be there, but we want to leave the door open to serve a very broad spectrum of affordability on this property. So some terms that support what I was talking about a little bit before, again in that blue bond continuum, 80% or less is defined as low income, and you can see all the way down to 30% or less. Extremely low income, those are historically the income levels that we serve at the Housing Authority.
And area median income right now this year is 60,000, 59,000?
For the Milwaukee area.
Your next slide.
Yeah, my next slide might get to it exactly. Well, thank you.
Oh, okay. Well, it
So
seems like
this
it should
needs a
be
little
with that.
bit- Yeah, a little bit updating. We'll have.
I was reading all this stuff again this morning, and I thought it was 58 or 59.
Correct. So,
Do you want me to go to the next slide?
no, we're okay right here. So
No,
the.
we're here. Okay.
Yeah, we're fine right here. So the question about area median income right now for the Milwaukee area, I'd have to look that up specifically for where it's at today. But that is roughly in the Portland metro area is around 81,000 for a household of 4 is that sort of median household income is I think what you're talking about. When we're talking about area median income, we're looking at the region and assessing incomes based on that. So it's relatively high for the Portland metro area. So it serves, when we talk about that, we're talking about the opportunity to serve those at a variety of incomes that have historically been wage-earning workforce incomes. And now you can switch slides, sorry. So when we're talking about who needs subsidized housing and some information that we can put to that, so those at 0 to 30% might be an older adult on a fixed income, maybe a retail worker that you might have in the community here in Milwaukee and in the surrounding areas. Those at 31 to 60% of area median income, that might look like a paramedic in our communities or a mail carrier. Could also be a nurse based on recent income analysis. And then when we're talking about 60 to 80%, which is really getting into that workforce housing or the traditional terms of workforce housing, we're talking about firefighters, school teachers, et cetera. What we know is that incomes aren't keeping pace anywhere near the cost of rental housing as increases. So I think we're going to see more and more categories added to this as time goes on. So with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
On the bottom of that slide
Yes.
that you just showed, is that the average rent for each of those, a 1-bedroom and a 2-bedroom?
Correct.
Right now?
Correct.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So I think you're all aware of the site. We're going to just spend a little bit of time recapping efforts to date in terms of the early part of the master plan, just to, although we've been in front of you several times, to give you an update, just to touch quickly on those. The property, as you know, is 2 parcels really, or 2 types of housing. The Manor, the 100 units, 9 stories, that's going to remain and is going to be renovated in the coming year. And it's the 100 units that are part of the park that will be part of the redevelopment. The area that is bold there is 16 acres. The Manor is about slightly over 2, or will be slightly over 2 of those acres, not including all of that open space.
Not including all of that open space?
No, the Manor and the parking and community gardens and other areas directly associated with the Manor are, but not the open space.
So it's probably
What?
4, including that open space.
It would be closer to 4.
I'm sorry, you said they are what? I couldn't hear the end of your sentence.
I'm sorry, I'll try to speak up a little bit more. The land around the Manor, including the parking space and the community garden, is about 2.5 acres. It does not include that open space to the north of it. If it did, I think the mayor is correct, it'd be closer to 4 acres. And then when you remove, currently the streets are public right-of-way. When you remove that, the acreage goes down even more. So currently, actually, if you just take all of the land and take out the right-of-way, it's about 14 acres. So we had we started this project well over a year ago, July of last year, and we had 2 kind of sections of our approach to the master planning process. The first half of our efforts were gathering information and listening. The second half was refining, also including listening and outreach, but really refine being starting with the design process. So you can see in the gather phase, we did a lot of analysis, demographic, market, preliminary traffic. We did stakeholder interviews. We did research about the site and zoning, listening sessions with tenants. So the listening sessions were just with the tenants of both the Manor and the park. We created an outreach and engagement plan. We had a sustainability charrette, and we had 3 visioning workshops that were open to not just the tenants, but the general community, One was just for stakeholders, 2 of them were for the general community. I apologize, I need to correct that. The general community ones, there was one held in the afternoon and one held in the evening.
Can I ask you to expand a little on what you did in the traffic analysis stage?
So we did an early preliminary traffic analysis with Lancaster Engineering, and they looked at what adding between 300 and 500 additional residential units would do in terms of the traffic impact on 3 adjacent intersections, Stevens Creek, Harrison, and 32nd, and then Harrison and 42nd, I believe.
You mean Johnson Creek?
Johnson Creek, thank you. Apologies.
It's like,
I translated.
And what they found out is even at the 500 additional housing units, it wasn't creating a tipping point beyond what the city had already identified in their transportation system analysis for 2038. So not to say it wouldn't have an impact, but it didn't make the impact any more severe in terms of creating additional recommendations beyond what had already been identified in the TSP.
Well, I
That
would've
didn't include,
That would have surprised me if it did, because I was part of that TSP, and I remember having conversations about the population at
Yeah.
that very site and making assumptions that it would be something like what we're talking about.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, so that's what that, and it didn't look at any commercial on the site. That is the one thing. It just looked at residents.
Great.
We know that as part of there was some confusion with the public in our last meeting with the Planning Commission last week about this graph, thinking that the closeout meant the master plan was being voted on and approved. And what we see this as is when we get to the closeout, we move to the next phase, which is actually the land use process. And so that's a whole nother process moving forward that will allow public input and will also require a more robust transportation analysis.
And I believe that we are slotted to discuss our transportation plan again in 2020. So this is something the city will be looking at in greater depths all over the city.
So then in the refine portion of our efforts, we did some internal design workshops prior to some community design workshops. Our evening community design workshop was fairly well attended. I believe we had 60 attendees. Through the input that we got out of that workshop, we refined master plan options down to 3. And we had a community open house and an online open house. After the feedback from that, we were able to narrow down the 3 options to one preferred option, which we'll discuss today and we'll present to you. At the community open house where we received comments on those, we also option 3 was chosen, but we further refined that option, and I'll point to 2 areas where we incorporated additional feedback we received at that open house, primarily from the Ardenwald neighborhood. So we have one now concept design that we're moving forward with in terms of having these working sessions, getting additional feedback, and we'll have one more community open house prior to kind of ending this section of the master plan process and moving into the land use. So I think we presented to you our analysis of the site before. This is sort of a graphic that helped explain a little bit better the kickoff in July of 18, our listening sessions with our residents, the visiting sessions that were open to the public, the sustainability workshop, community design workshop, community open house, and draft master plan. Along the way, we had a planning committee that was combined stakeholders, well, not stakeholders, that's going to be confusing, combined our design team and various members of city and the Housing Authority and staff. Then we had our stakeholder committee, which met periodically prior usually to one of our bigger outreach events, and that included greater members of the community.
And real quickly, if I can add, at the same time, parallel to this whole process, and part of our committee was also the Clackamas County commissioned a health impact analysis, as I think you all are very well aware. And though that is still being refined and hasn't been published 100%, at each one of these moments, that health impact analysis then gleaned the information from the larger stakeholder groups, the stakeholder committee, as well as public input that then helped to drive where we ultimately have wound up in these three different options and the third one that we'll select and show to you today. As soon as we have the health impact analysis and it's been reviewed and published and authorized, we will share that with everyone.
What's the time frame on that?
Well, frankly, I hopefully that it's done here by early September. That's my understanding. I believe it's done. I think it's just going through some final editing right now, and so we can get you all in advance look at that.
Thanks.
This is just a little bit more information about each of those outreach efforts. I think one thing I want to just focus on was the community design workshop. We had, I said 60 community members and Hillside residents attended. The online open house also had 277 unique visitors going to that site as well. And we had three concepts. Community Heart was one in which we had, one thing that we got from the listening sessions was people really wanted some type of community component in this neighborhood that would have the ability, ideas thrown out were a Boys and Girls Club or that type of thing, Head Start facility, an area where there could be different things like medical services for the residents, the current residents. So option one had that in the center of our new envisioned neighborhood. Option two had more of a promenade, turning 29th into more of a pedestrian promenade. It still had vehicular traffic. And I'll note that that was one of the biggest areas of feedback we received last week when we were in front of the Planning Commission for the work session was a lot of concern from the Ardenwell neighborhood about 29th being vehicular access. That is in the TSP, and so it is in our master plan currently, or our proposed master plan. And concept two kind of turned that a little bit more into a promenade on one end, the end that's on the west side of 29th. That one actually got the least votes. And finally, concept three was more of a green network, which in all concepts, I think I should point out, the open space to the north of the Manor was shown as continuing to serve as open space. And one of the reasons for that is it's a much lower elevation than the rest of the site and is not really served by the city's sewer system. In order to construct a building on that site, there would have to be a sewage pump, and that's currently actually what the Manor has to do for their ground floor. So it was deemed that that was not a site that was going to be particularly attractive or feasible as a building site. So I just wanted to remind people of that. Nonetheless, we envision multiple open space areas in this feature neighborhood, and concept three, more than any other, sprinkled them around the neighborhood in smaller ways than making a big move. One thing that was consistent with the feedback we've been receiving all along and our three master plan options that we presented at the open house was that the density that would be required to achieve the Housing Authority's goals on this site, most people agreed it would make sense along 32nd, and not even the full length of 32nd, but you'll see from the image the lower two-thirds of 32nd, the southern two-thirds of 32nd that are more directly across from the Providence complex. And then Meek was seen as also a logical place to have density given the GMU zoning of the property immediately to the south that's currently undeveloped. To be respectful and to step down to the single-family home residential to the north, it was identified obviously as that would be logical to have lower density there. So this is our proposed draft master plan as it currently stands. It is a modified version of the third option that we showed, which we called the Green Network. And I'm going to walk you through the components of it. When we presented the master plan last time to council, we had generally this layout of a street grid. And if, to refresh people's memory, we are proposing a brand-new street grid for several reasons. The existing street grid, of course, is dead-end and doesn't promote the pedestrian and vibrant neighborhood that is envisioned. The other challenge that we have, though, is that the stormwater and sewer aren't in the right-of-way, which is typical, but they are currently between the housing units of the park. And so if they were in the right-of-way, maybe we could have envisioned salvaging some of the right-of-way. Other reasons why we are proposing this current street grid is Hillside Court, as it currently stands, comes in right about here where the little hand is, and working with the city, we really need to align it with Dwyer across the street because of safety concerns of having the offset streets. So that needs to happen anyway. And then we have 29th connecting up to the Ardmore neighborhood to the north, and the desire, of course, to have that connect down to the south. Not knowing exactly how the property to the south is going to be developed, we're showing it coming here at Meek. Sorry. We are also showing Meek extending. Currently, it stops at C Street, which is 29th. So we're showing it extending and becoming a secondary access point for the Manor. That's important because as this project will be phased, we're seeing these lower lots as being the first phases. We need to maintain access to the Manor at all times when the upper northern portion of the site gets developed. So the extension of Meek allows that. Through the health, oh, sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to ask, so you're no longer talking about selling off one of the blocks?
Oh, no, I mean, we still are considering that as a possibility. We're just, I think what Lisa's highlighting here is that our development plan has been, for a variety of reasons, always to work sort of south to north, starting likely in the lower right-hand corner. We are still keeping that as an option to possibly sell that off, and that might be, again, to my point earlier, that might be the way to attract even a higher concentration or interest in market rate development and some of the neighborhood commercial.
And so that would change, I mean, will you make that decision before you go for your land use, or will you go for your land use on something like this and hold that decision till further down? I guess what I'm trying to get at is how does that affect the total number of units?
Yeah, I think that the intent has always been for us to whether clearly stated by myself or others, to stick to the 400, the net new, as in the new key, which has been revised to provide clarity, the net new units of 400 units. Whether or not those net new units are 100% developed out by the Housing Authority, or they're developed out in concert with nonprofit partners or market rate developers, we still would be talking about the same level of density that we would pursue through the master plan process. If a particular developer came in and wanted a site and decided that they did not want that many units on that site, I guess that's something at that point in time they'd have, if we had sold the lot, for instance, they'd have to determine whether or not at that point in time that worked in their pro forma. But the sales, if we were to sell a lot, one of the things that does for us is provide additional cash flow to help spur on the second phase of development.
Have you been in conversation with Bridge Meadows more recently?
We have. We actually did last week.
Good.
So we had to sit down with them. Yes, a wonderful organization and very unique opportunities, and we've had conversations about this site and others.
Okay, good. Thanks.
I think the other thing from a street standpoint I wanted to point out, or a lot standpoint, I guess, is that option 3, which became this proposed current option, was unique in that it created a sliver, a new lot, Lot K, and we shifted 29th over a little bit to the east, and what that allowed us to do is provide this concept opportunity for a very small scale development that could be well suited for homeownership potential. And so that was something that appealed as well. And our other two options didn't have housing on either side of 29th, as you came down from the neighborhood. And so now these are groups of 4 townhomes that we're showing on either side. And so that scale links better to the single-family home neighborhood, and also just from a street standpoint provides more of a residential neighborhood scale. So that was seen as attractive by many people as well for this option. To refresh people's memories, everything in pink is a townhouse type housing typology. So you can see it's up here where we said lower density seemed more appropriate. One thing that I'll point out that we did do is originally in our open house, when this was option 3, we were showing these as potentially being 3 stories. We realized that easily this housing typology could still provide the same number of units with being a 2-story. And that was addressing the concerns of the neighbors to the north that having that height. So as we move forward in trying to determine how to set the goals of this planned development, talking about a step-down height to the north is something that we'll be proceeding with.
And I believe you also rotated them 90 degrees, so rather than having the
There were several
face
options.
toward the neighborhood to the north.
There were several options, and this option had the short end of the buildings
So
adjacent.
the overall massing effect to the neighborhood is
Exactly.
reduced.
Exactly. So the blue are, the housing typology for the blue are 3 stories, and it's more of a, what we call a walk-up. So there might be ground floor units that we call flats, and they have access right onto a separate patio or that type of thing. And then there might be townhomes above that you walk up 1 flight of stairs and get into your unit. So it's not an elevator building. And this type of building is also relatively easy to break the scale of the roof forms down and the massing down, so that it, again, also is something that is, we see as compatible with more compatible with the neighborhood to the north than elevator apartment blocks.
So does that mean that it would be, you have a flat on the first floor and then 2-story townhouses? Is that what
Correct.
you're
So it's still
envisioning?
3 stories, yes.
Yes.
Still 3 stories.
And you'll have an opportunity if you're all walking Northwest Housing Alternatives grand opening. That's a function, a form that they used regularly throughout their development. Flats on the bottom, but the 2-story townhome
Yep.
above.
And I want to point out that because of the grade change at this corner of the property, you'll see, if you look at this in more detail later, you'll see our legends in the upper right-hand corner say how tall the building is, and it says between 2 and 3 stories on this, and that's because this slopes down greatly to the west, and so by all intents and purposes, this building, if it were to be built in this location, would appear to be a 2-story building. If you were back here in the parking area, it would appear to be a 3-story building. So we are trying to be very cognizant of that step-down height to the neighborhood to the north. Looking at the diagram that we showed earlier about where density seemed to make the most sense to everybody was along 32nd and Meek. So the purple buildings are mixed-use buildings. The diagonal hatching that you see indicates commercial on the ground floor. All of the purple buildings, all the purple buildings are 4 stories, as are these yellow buildings here. So we're proposing 4 stories wrapping the property here, just like that diagram of high density showed. So we're only showing commercial on 32nd, and this is scaled, this amount of square footage is scaled more to neighborhood commercial, 1,000 square feet, multiple sites at 1,000 square feet that might be a cafe, a coffee shop, a tax preparer. It could even be a small medical clinic, urgent care, Zoom care, something like that. I don't know if that would happen across from Providence, but that type of neighborhood amenity and not a regional amenity. It's not scaled for that. That being said, as I mentioned earlier, there was a desire for a community space on this property. And so this other purple one off to the side here, the whole ground floor of that, other than a little residential lobby, is being envisioned as that community space. That obviously would have to be something that the Housing Authority would be working with a partner in the future to figure out how to make this happen. But the 2 places where we showed that, because it came out of our community design workshop, were either in this location or this location. The railroad is quite an issue on this property, and So minimizing the amount of housing next to the railroad was seen as a positive. That being said, the community space would be anchoring the end of 29th from a neighborhood standpoint and be kitty corner to this open area here, this open area here, and this little section of street, Hillside Court, we're really seeing as a little street that has bump outs for tree wells and really is narrowed down to be more of a pedestrian street. It's not it's only connecting the tower residents with this area, and this has become, right here, we initially, when we were doing very early studies, had thought about this as being a vehicular connection. The city understandably doesn't want it because it's too close to this one down here, and so we've maintained it as a pedestrian access point. So there would be easements to maintain this as a pedestrian point, allowing members of the residents of the Manor to have a rich pedestrian experience as they come over to 32nd and get to the bus stop right here. This is, because this is a pedestrian easement, is envisioned as a plaza that could be shared between the commercial zones. This large green circle here is a mature tree on the site, and we had initially shown this plaza as smaller, but after feedback from the neighborhood, we've widened the plaza and are showing the preservation of that large mature tree.
And it's a little hard to see on the screen, so I just wanted to call out that, what is the beige intersection on 29th and Hillside? It looks like that is also a plaza
So
of
there
some
was
sort?
concerns about traffic on 29th and speed. What we're trying to propose here is this would be some special paving that would be in front of the community center, be a linkage across here, past the community garden and open play area, to this zone here that's an all pedestrian zone. So the concept is that this special paving would create this pedestrian linkage from 32nd all the way across to the community center. It could also be raised crosswalks, and that would really be something that would also help slow down traffic and identify the area as a pedestrian area.
Mm-hmm. And do you know the rough square footage of what the community center would be?
I do not have this on that.
It can be really rough.
I'm thinking between 15 and 20,000 square feet. No, that wouldn't be right. I would say closer to 15,000 square feet.
Okay, thanks.
But this is conceptual, too. I mean, we're showing conceptually green space. We've gotten a lot of funny comments about our soccer area. It's a futsal size and not a soccer size. But conceptually, that there would be green space associated with the community. And I apologize for not knowing that answer. I can look it up and give Aaron that.
Roughly the size of our library.
Mm-hmm. It's 18, yeah.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense to me, yes. Mm-hmm. So I think that I've hit on the main concepts.
So the yellow buildings?
Oh, sorry, thank you. That was the last one. So the yellow buildings are residential only, not mixed use, but 4 stories. And the little green areas on either side are indicating that these would have residences on the ground floor, and they could also have their own little patio or garden out in space, out in front. And so there'd be a setback from the street. These would be more like stoops that you would see in a residential neighborhood. So that really the only kind of mixed-use zone would really be 32nd and this sort of pedestrian plaza that we're creating, and then the community area.
Can you explain the 4 numbers in the hatch?
Yes. So we have this legend here. So we have the building number is the largest one. The number of units is in the lower right-hand corner. The stories is in the upper right-hand corner, and it can be a little confusing. This says 3/1, which means 4 stories total, 3 stories of residential over 1 story of commercial, and that hatch is trying to indicate that as well, which is in our legend on the right-hand side also. The upper left-hand side is the parking ratio, and that was the last thing I was going to touch on. So the parking ratio, similar to the housing typology, changes. When we're up here in the townhouses, we're 1-to-1. When we're at the walk-ups, we're at a little over 0.8, which is what current code would allow for the GMU district within 500 feet of a transit a transit street or high-service transit street, which 32nd is. Then, and the community building is 0.9 also because of that shared parking as well, the additional parking needs that the community would have. Where we get down to very low parking counts are blocks E, A, and B, and those are 0.4 or lower. And those areas are a little bit more recognizing kind of the mixed use or high-density housing that the city of Portland might be looking at if you're along a transit street. So these are testing different types of parking counts within the total master plan. But you'll see that 600 units total on site are proposed. With on-street and off-street parking combined, 500 stalls is being proposed.
So some of the earlier drafts had the buildings along 32nd having tuck-under parking, and that's no longer part of the plan?
Currently, we're not showing that because we're reducing actually the building footprint rather than doing the tuck-under parking. It's entirely possible to do that and reduce the commercial footprint.
So that, the buildings with the lowest ratio, well, at least two of them are the buildings with commercial uses in them that will also have parking demands, presumably.
That's why I wanted to point out that these would be neighborhood size. The other thing I want to point out is in a pre-app that we had recently with the city, they're wanting to start to consider doing parallel parking along 32nd.
Do you know off the top of your head what the current percentage of residents, so the 200 units we already have on site, how many of those people have cars or use cars?
That would be interesting.
The health impact analysis looked at the Manor, and we need to verify what the park is, but the Manor is below it's about 0.3, correct, Stephen? 0.33.
Yeah, and the park.
0.33 cars per unit.
Yeah, and I think that, and I don't have that number right off the top of my head, and we can certainly share that with you as well.
Great.
The park is not significantly more than that, but it is higher than the Manor.
I was going to say, I thought I recalled from one of the earlier meetings like a 0.6 for the park. But the thing is, the park is currently, many of the residents are older Ukrainians from a culture where women didn't necessarily learn to drive. So what the parking demand is now versus when you start having families and workforce participants, I think are very different things.
Those 200 units, those people are still going to be living on site. So their current parking needs are not going to change.
Right.
And I think that we have a couple more slides, and I'm cognizant that we were supposed to be done, so I'm just quickly going to touch on those. One is that we wanted to point out that open space for the property current design is 43%, which is 13% greater than the target for planned developments, and then the tree canopy for the entire site at maturity is at 40%.
Well done.
I'm going to sort of skip over the streets and just go to our phasing plan. So conceptually, lots A and B, which are the two corner lots, would be first, and that's for several reasons. One is to minimize relocation. In the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the little red squares. Those are the Hillside Park households that would need to be relocated for this first phase, so we're trying to minimize that. You can see right below that the right-of-way, the existing right-of-way that would have to be vacated, and then below that, in the lower left-hand corner, the proposed new right-of-ways that would be part of Phase 1. Phase 1 continues to allow access to the site through Hillside Court to the north, and minimizes the disruption to the residents living to the north, because they have their utilities coming from the north won't be disrupted, and their access won't be disrupted. There are utilities available in Meek, and so therefore this also makes sense to start at the southern end of the property.
And so phase 1 would also include building the building Meek out all the way to the Manor?
Currently, we're not showing that. That would be Phase 2. And so Phase 2, it's very important, thank you for pointing that out. This extension of Meek all the way up to the Manor is critical because the last phase, which also may be in multiple phases, will disrupt the access to the Manor by needing to do the realignment of Dwyer. So this phase would need to extend Meek. In order to reduce the cost of Phase 1, we're not showing that extension in Phase 1.
So roughly how many units would be in Phase 1?
I believe it's just shy of 40 units. I used to have this stuff memorized, and I apologize.
That's okay.
But it's, I think it was 34.
Yeah. So
Phase 1?
relocation, I think, are you
You're talking
asking
about relocation.
potential new construction units or?
Sorry, yes, that's a good clarification.
Oh, I
Potential new
misunderstood.
construction units, yes.
And I think if you can go back ahead.
I will.
So I think anticipating that lots
A little over 200.
Yeah, lots A and B would be the first lots to go in some configuration there, so yes.
Okay.
To Councilor Beatty's point, about 200 units.
And I think one thing to be very clear about pointing out is B was identified as, right now, the most logical property for the Housing Authority to start to build the relocation units for the park residents. And so what we tried to do is test whether what it felt like to get 100 units on that property, i.e. 100 units being what the Hillside Park households currently stand at.
But I think it's also important to note in that from a massing standpoint, from understanding all that, we also want to provide opportunity for our residents to return and be able to have opportunity within a variety of the buildings on the site. And so we don't anticipate that all of them are going to want to come back to just one building type or at one particular time. We anticipate that there'll be opportunity for our residents to return throughout the property. But again, to Lisa's point, saying that Lot B would be the most logical place for us to begin that replacement unit strategy so that we can have those folks that are temporarily relocated, give them first right of refusal to come back.
Great.
Do you have a rough sense of timing on the phases?
Overall development timing?
Isn't that kind of us?
The first stage would be obviously working through the process with the city and staff and that whole. We're hopeful that once we get to construction, there's a lot of site work that needs to be done, so the first phase is going to take longer. I'm anticipating that the first phase is a good couple of years worth of work just in construction, moving things around, getting those utilities up, getting the roadway improvements done, a tremendous amount of capital needed for that, with the hope that then we can be working through those phases over subsequent years over the next, 6 to 7 to 8 years, somewhere along in there. Within the process of us coming forward with the plan development, we'll also be, I think we'll need to be working with staff to understand the timeline associated with that and how long we would be allowed under our approvals to extend out the overall development.
The current code for the plan development has been recently changed to have a 7-year timeline. That may not be long enough, so a 7-year timeline with the potential for a 2-year extension, I believe.
That's right.
Correct, yeah.
Mayor and Council, I just want to let you know we're about 5 minutes past time.
Yeah, unfortunately, because I have more questions, but yeah, we should adjourn and go to the other event. I look forward to having more conversations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And for the public, everything that we've discussed in this presentation are in our packet for the work session, so they are available online.
Yes, as always.
Thank you.
All right, we are adjourned in the work session. We will be back here at 6. If you had wanted to comment on this particular thing, please hang out. We'll see you soon.